15. Gospel legends who were drunk all the time. They preached deliverance but drank themselves into despair. They led worship while secretly battling bottles behind closed doors. These aren't the scandals you hear in Sunday sermons. This is the raw, uncomfortable truth behind gospel's biggest names. From Grammy winners to choir directors, some of the most iconic figures in gospel music were drowning in addiction while lifting others in praise. So why don't we talk about it? Welcome to Legends of Black Excellence, where we uncover the powerful, painful, and redemptive stories you were never told. Hit that subscribe button like this video and get ready to see gospel history like never before. Michael W. Smith. Long before arenas echoed with voices singing, "Open the eyes of my heart," Michael W. Smith was quietly battling something far more destructive than any critic or spiritual doubt: his own dependence on alcohol. Celebrated as a pioneer of modern worship and a defining figure in contemporary Christian music, CCM Smith's polished public image concealed years of private turmoil. The pressures of non-stop touring, the burden of spiritual leadership, and the unrealistic expectations placed on him as a moral compass for millions gradually chipped away at his inner peace. Rather than implode in public scandal, Smith chose to fight his demons in silence. Behind every performance and pastoral smile was a man torn between his calling and the growing emptiness inside. He described in later interviews that the weight of fame, coupled with his desire to please both God and the world, left him emotionally drained. Alcohol became his escape, an invisible crutch in an industry where admitting weakness could mean exile. His addiction, though carefully hidden for years, began to take its toll. Smith felt a growing disconnect between the songs he wrote and the man he was becoming. That dissonance pushed him to the brink, forcing a reckoning not only with himself, but with his understanding of grace. When he finally opened up about his struggle, it wasn't for sympathy. It was a declaration of war against the culture of silence in the church. Rather than retreat, Smith leaned into vulnerability. With the support of his family and a renewed relationship with his faith, he sought treatment and began a long journey toward healing. His openness inspired countless fans and fellow believers who had once assumed that spiritual strength meant moral perfection. Today, Michael W. Smith isn't just known for his chart-topping albums or his decades of influence. He's become a symbol of spiritual resilience. By confronting his addiction head-on and choosing to live transparently, he redefined what true worship looks like. Not flawless, not unshaken, but faithful even when wounded. His story is a reminder that grace doesn't skip the broken, it seeks them out. Leandria Johnson. Leandria Johnson didn't enter the gospel world quietly. She exploded into it. With a voice as raw as her testimony, she claimed victory on BET's Sunday Best in 2010, instantly hailed as the future of gospel music. But her rise came with a cost. Fame didn't fix her brokenness, it magnified it. Unlike many who carefully protect their public image, Leandria refused to hide her flaws. She drank, she cursed, she questioned the church, and she said it all out loud online, unapologetically. Her transparency was jarring to some, refreshing to others. In a world that demanded polished perfection, she bared her pain bottle in hand, tear-streaked and unfiltered. Her struggle with alcohol wasn't tucked behind closed doors. It played out in front of millions on Facebook Live. In 2021, one of her most viral moments was a profanity-laced rant criticizing the hypocrisy in the gospel industry and admitting she was drinking heavily. For many, it was too much. For others, it was the first time they saw someone anointed look like them, imperfect, angry, and desperate for grace. Johnson's drinking was not without consequence. It affected her shows, her church relationships, and even her bookings. But through it all, her faith never disappeared. It just looked different. She often reminded followers that she was not God, just a vessel struggling like everyone else. Eventually, Leandria sought help, entering rehab and recommitting herself to recovery. But she never sanitized her story. Instead, she turned her pain into ministry, launching support initiatives for people battling addiction and mental health. Her music, including songs like Better Days, became lifelines for the weary, sung by someone who understood every note of suffering. Leandria's legacy is not one of shame, it's one of truth. She proved that ministry doesn't always wear robes and speak softly. Sometimes it screams in agony before healing begins. Her bravery to be broken in public is changing how the gospel world talks about addiction, humanity, and grace. Jason Fowler. Jason Fowler had the voice, the look, and the platform. As a rising star in Christian rock and worship music, he stood on stages commanding thousands. His songs stirred hearts, his presence inspired young believers, but no one saw the war raging within. Alcohol had snuck into his life not as rebellion, but as relief. Slowly, the occasional drink turned into a nightly need. For a time, he managed to maintain the image. On Sundays, he led worship. During the week, he battled withdrawals. It wasn't until the drinking became unmanageable that everything began to crumble. Opportunities dried up. Friends drifted away. Jason's life spiraled into chaos, and soon he found himself without a home, living in his car, still trying to write songs for a God he no longer felt worthy to approach. What made Jason's fall so devastating was the contrast. Here was a man known for leading others to freedom, now shackled to addiction himself. But it was in the solitude of that car, broken and numb, that the turning point came. He reached out for help, entering a faith-based rehab program. It didn't just sober him up, it restored him. Rather than erase the past, Jason embraced it. His testimony became the centerpiece of his renewed ministry. He began speaking openly about addiction, especially within Christian spaces, where silence and shame often dominate. His music took on a new depth, no longer just praise but confession, redemption, and truth. Songs like Come Alive told the story of a man brought back from spiritual and emotional death. Jason Fowler today is more than a singer. He's a survivor with a purpose to show that addiction doesn't disqualify you from grace, it sets the stage for it. His concerts are filled not just with fans, but with people who see themselves in his scars. He once led worship in pretense. Now he does it in power born from pain and a redemption earned through surrender. Candy Staton. Before she ever stepped into the bright lights of gospel stardom, Candy Staton had already survived more than most. Born in 1940 in rural Alabama, she was married at 15, a mother by 16, and caught in an abusive marriage long before her name ever graced a record. Her voice, equal parts grit and grace, carried the pain of those early years into every lyric she sang. Candy found initial fame in the gospel circuit as a teenager, but it was her crossover into R&B and disco that made her a household name. Hits like Young Hearts Run Free topped charts, yet the woman behind the microphone was anything but free. As her fame soared in the 1970s, so did her drinking. By her own admission, she was consuming a quart of vodka daily, a staggering amount that slowly unraveled her health relationships and emotional well-being. Unlike some, Staton didn't lose everything overnight. Her records still sold, her shows still booked. But inside, she was unraveling. Alcohol became her answer to emotional wounds that hadn't healed, to pressures she couldn't articulate. Behind the sequins and stage lights was a woman spiraling. The turning point came not with an overdose or a collapse, but with a quiet spiritual awakening. Tired of pretending, Candy returned to her roots in gospel music during the 1980s and 90s. But this wasn't the same church girl who once toured with the Soul Stirrers. This time, she brought her scars with her. Albums like Stand Up and Be a Witness weren't just musical projects, they were testimonies. She began to speak openly about her battles with alcohol and domestic abuse, offering hope to other women suffering in silence. Her voice, matured by both pain and victory, became a vessel for healing. Now, in her 80s, Staton continues to perform, collaborate, and inspire. Her life proves that survival isn't always clean or quiet, but it's powerful. She didn't just recover, she reinvented, rebuilt, and reclaimed her voice. And when she sings of deliverance, you know she means every word. Helen Baylor. Helen Baylor didn't just sing gospel. She lived through the kind of darkness that makes gospel necessary. Long before she filled churches with powerful anthems, she was Helen Rose Hudson, a young girl from Los Angeles with a voice that could shatter silence. That voice took her into the secular world, singing backup for stars like Chaka Khan, Lou Rawls, and even Stevie Wonder in the 1970s. But fame came with a cost. Behind the glamorous image was a young woman spiraling into the grip of addiction. Cocaine, marijuana, and most destructively alcohol became her daily companions. Baylor found herself on a dangerous path, one that didn't lead to red carpets, but to park benches where she once slept after nights of using. She stole to support her habit. Her promising career vanished beneath the weight of her addictions. Her moment of change came in 1983. Tired, spiritually bankrupt, and emotionally destroyed, she walked into a church and collapsed into tears. That day marked her surrender not just to sobriety but to God. It wasn't instant. Recovery was a battle, but she fought, and with every small victory her voice returned, not just musically but spiritually. When Helen re-entered the gospel world in the late 1980s, she brought with her a story most artists kept hidden. Her breakthrough album, highly recommended, was more than a collection of songs. It was a confession, a proclamation, and a roadmap for others still trapped in addiction. Her raspy, soul-drenched contralto sang of struggle, yes, but also of victory. She didn't stop at music. Baylor began working with women's recovery programs, advocating for addiction awareness in faith communities where shame often silences suffering. She never pretended to be fixed, only redeemed. Her music became a healing balm for the wounded, honest enough to admit relapse, but strong enough to promise hope. Now in her 70s, Helen Baylor stands as living proof that no pit is too deep for grace to find you. Her past wasn't erased, it was transformed. And today, her voice still echoes not from a stage of perfection, but from a life rebuilt brick by brick, prayer by prayer. Lecrae. Lecrae didn't ask for the spotlight. He wrestled it into submission. Born in Houston and raised amid brokenness, his life was marked by chaos long before his name lit up Christian charts. He never knew his father. He saw drugs before he saw stability. And by the time he was a teenager, alcohol and street culture were as normal to him as church was to others. When he found faith in college, it didn't erase his past, it complicated it. The Christian world was eager to embrace his talent, but less willing to confront his trauma. Lecrae didn't just bring beats and bars to the gospel industry. He brought questions about race, identity, hypocrisy, and pain. And under the weight of expectation, he cracked. As his fame grew, so did the pressure to conform to an image of squeaky clean Christianity. Lecrae was touring, preaching, selling out venues, but drinking in hotel rooms at night, numbing the wounds he was too afraid to name. Depression stalked him. Trauma from past abuse haunted him, and the alcohol that once seemed like relief turned into a chain. In his memoir, I Am Restored, he revealed the extent of his descent, how he nearly quit music, walked away from ministry, and drowned in the very pain his lyrics tried to heal. But Lecrae didn't hide. He checked into therapy, took time off, and came back with Restoration, a brutally honest album that laid bare his flaws. Lecrae didn't just survive addiction, he used it to redefine the boundaries of gospel truth. Through his Reach Records label and nonprofit work, he's mentored young artists to be both holy and human. He's preached in churches and prisons, in stadiums and shelters, proving you can be both scarred and sanctified. His story is not about rebellion, it's about redemption. In Lecrae's gospel, freedom isn't found in forgetting the pain, it's found in telling the truth about it. Ben Fuller. Ben Fuller was never supposed to be here, not on stage, not on charts, and certainly not in ministry. Raised on a dairy farm in Vermont, he grew up with work boots, country songs, and a hidden ache he couldn't explain. His descent into addiction started young, but it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, progressive, and deceptively normal. What began as casual drinking in high school turned into full-blown alcoholism by adulthood. By the time he took a commercial fishing job in Alaska, Ben was spiraling. Far from home and deep in depression, his nights were filled with whiskey, his days with regret. At his worst, he blacked out in a pickup truck, unsure how he got there. His relationships crumbled, his confidence vanished, and suicide hovered as a real option. But grace came in the form of rock bottom. A friend invited him to a Christian rehab program. He said yes because he had nothing left to lose. What he didn't expect was how music would re-enter his life, not as distraction, but as healing. He began writing songs in recovery, pouring every broken memory into lyrics that didn't pretend, but prayed. Ben's breakout singles like Who I Am and He Found Me weren't born from ambition, they were born from survival. His voice, gritty and weathered, didn't belong to a pop star. It belonged to a man who nearly drank himself to death and lived to tell the story. That authenticity connected with audiences instantly. Unlike many Christian singers who grew up in church, Ben walked into faith through fire. He sings of sobriety not as a finish line, but a daily choice. Offstage, he shares his journey with men in recovery centers, reminding them that redemption isn't reserved for the pulpit. It's possible in rehab halls, too. Today, Ben Fuller is a rising star in country gospel, but he's not chasing awards. He's chasing impact. His testimony isn't polished. It's raw, and that's what makes it powerful. Because when he sings about being found, he means it. He was lost in addiction, and now he's a living, singing example of mercy. Josh Wilson. Josh Wilson wasn't the kind of artist you'd expect to struggle. With his clean-cut image, acoustic guitar, and lyrics rooted in hope, he represented the softer side of contemporary Christian music. Hits like Savior Please and I Refuse painted a picture of a grounded, faith-filled songwriter. But what fans didn't see was the undercurrent of anxiety, perfectionism, and eventually dependency that began to shape his private world. Unlike the stereotypical story of rebellion and self-destruction, Josh's battle was quieter, but no less real. The pressures of constant touring, writing, performing, and maintaining the image of a flawless Christian artist created a mental toll. Panic attacks began to strike with increasing frequency. Concerts became a source of dread. Sleep disappeared. And in those dark, silent hotel rooms, alcohol became a secret escape, not for thrill, but for peace. He tried to manage it alone, like many in the ministry world, but his body began to speak louder than his denial. When he released Carry Me in 2013, it wasn't just another worship album, it was a lifeline. The title track candidly described his need for God to lift him out of fear and fatigue. For many listeners, it was a beautiful song. For Josh, it was a cry for help. Instead of hiding, Josh chose the harder path. He opened up. He talked publicly about mental health addiction's subtle grip and the shame that often silences Christian leaders. His willingness to address these issues reshaped his career. No longer just a performer, he became a comforter for the anxious and overwhelmed. Known for playing multiple instruments, Wilson used his Build-A-Song live performances not just as entertainment but as healing rituals, inviting the audience into his vulnerability. He traded perfection for presence. Today, Josh Wilson still wrestles, but no longer alone. His music feels less like a sermon and more like a journal. And in an industry built on loud declarations of victory, his quiet honesty cuts deeper. He reminds us that even those who seem steady can silently unravel. But with courage, confession and community healing is always possible, even for those who lead the chorus. Russ Taff. If you only listened to his voice, you'd think Russ Taff had it all figured out. With a soaring tenor that could shake a sanctuary, he helped redefine Southern gospel in the late 1970s and 80s. As the lead singer of the Imperials, he brought a raw, emotional power that made classics like Praise the Lord unforgettable. But behind the spotlights and Dove Awards was a man unraveling, and alcohol was the thread pulling him apart. Russ wasn't a rebel. He was raised in a strict Pentecostal household where emotions were silenced and image meant everything. When pain surfaced, especially childhood trauma, it wasn't talked about. It was pushed down. So when success came, Russ didn't know how to cope with the buried hurt. He just knew how to sing over it and drink through it. At the height of his solo career in the 1980s, Taff was winning Grammys by day and drinking alone by night. The same voice that brought healing to millions masked a man battling addiction in silence. For years, he carried the contradiction preaching victory while drowning in vodka. His 1989 album, The Way Home, cracked that image, especially with the haunting track Hard Road to Travel, a brutally honest depiction of his alcoholism. Eventually, the double life broke him. Russ entered rehab confronting decades of trauma and dependence. But instead of stepping away from music, he stepped back into it with new truth. His voice was no longer just technically powerful. It was emotionally devastating, marked by pain and resurrection. In the years that followed, Taff didn't hide his journey. He became an outspoken advocate for recovery and mental health, particularly within the church. His documentary, I Still Believe, peeled back the curtain on his struggles, helping other believers shed the shame of addiction. Russ Taff's legacy isn't just in his unforgettable vocals, it's in his survival. He didn't clean himself up to stay in gospel. He brought the mess with him and sang louder. Today his voice still echoes older, yes, but more honest than ever. Because when you've lived the lyrics, the music hits differently. Ashley Cleveland. Ashley Cleveland didn't fit the mold of a traditional gospel star. She didn't try to. With a voice soaked in whiskey and gravel, she stepped into the Christian music world in the early 1990s, sounding more like a Southern blues rocker than a worship leader. But what set her apart wasn't just the sound, it was the truth. Her truth. And it was messy. Behind her Grammy-winning albums and electrifying stage presence was a long, painful battle with addiction. Alcohol wasn't a weekend indulgence for Ashley. It was a way of life, one that began early and nearly took everything from her. By her own account, she was drinking heavily by her teens, numbing childhood wounds she couldn't name. The louder the applause got, the deeper the void became. When her 1991 debut, Big Town, dropped, audiences were stunned not only by her powerful voice, but by the rawness of her lyrics. This wasn't sanitized gospel. It was redemption set to rock and roll. But behind the scenes, she was barely holding it together. Her addictions cost her relationships, threatened her career, and left her emotionally bankrupt. It took a brutal wake-up call, a failed marriage, spiritual burnout, and total exhaustion for Cleveland to finally seek recovery. Her memoir, Little Black Sheep, lays it all bare: the blackouts, the lies, the shame, and the miracle of grace that pulled her back. Rehab wasn't a moment, it was a war. But she fought for her sobriety. She still fights. Ashley didn't get clean to fit in. She got honest to break free. Her later albums, like Before the Daylight's Shot, carry the weight of a woman who lived through addiction and lived to sing about it. Her music bridges rock clubs and church altars, giving voice to those who never saw themselves in perfect Christians. She's now over 30 years sober, a wife, a mother, a survivor. But above all, she's a truth teller. Ashley Cleveland proved that the gospel wasn't reserved for the polished, it was meant for the broken. And when she sings about grace, it's not theology, it's testimony. James Cleveland. James Cleveland was called the King of Gospel for a reason. His thunderous voice, commanding choir arrangements, and powerful songwriting transformed gospel music forever. From the 1960s until his death in 1991, he was a revered figure, a mentor to generations, a recording powerhouse, and a spiritual father to the genre. But for all his triumphs on stage, Cleveland carried a burden behind the pulpit that was rarely discussed. Though known for songs like Peace Be Still and Lord Help Me to Hold Out, Cleveland was reportedly no stranger to the numbing grip of alcohol. As his fame grew, so did the expectations placed upon him, not just as an artist, but as a minister, a mentor, and a moral example. Behind that title, came isolation, and behind isolation came coping mechanisms. Cleveland's drinking was largely kept in the shadows, especially in an era when public confession was taboo in the church. He never made a public spectacle of his struggle, but those close to him knew he sometimes turned to alcohol to silence the pressure, the fatigue, and the personal wounds he carried quietly. Some accounts suggested that it occasionally impacted performances, rehearsals, and relationships behind the scenes. Yet even through his inner turmoil, James continued to create. He founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, nurturing artists like Aretha Franklin and the Winans. His ability to pull raw emotion out of choirs was unmatched. But those same emotions were often rooted in his own hidden battles. His life was a complex contradiction, a man of God wrestling with personal pain. But what made Cleveland's story powerful wasn't perfection, it was perseverance. He kept going, he kept building, and he kept believing that even flawed vessels could carry divine music. James Cleveland's legacy is not without shadows, but it's also not without grace. He gave the world gospel music that healed millions while quietly seeking healing himself. In that tension, he showed us something real that even the greatest voices need deliverance too. Louis Johnson. To many, Louis Johnson was a musical magician, the funk mastermind whose bass lines helped define an era. As half of the chart-topping duo the Brothers Johnson, he worked with legends like Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones, delivering grooves on hits like Stomp and I'll Be Good to You. But while his fingers danced effortlessly across the strings, his personal life was steadily unraveling off stage. Nicknamed Thunder Thumbs for his lightning-fast playing, Louis brought unprecedented energy to the R&B and gospel scenes. His contributions to Quincy Jones's productions and Thriller cemented his place in music history. Yet beneath that brilliance lurked a growing dependence that few outside the studio suspected. Alcohol became a quiet companion, not a loud crisis, and that's what made it so dangerous. Louis wasn't the type to crash headlines with scandals. His struggle was slow, internal, and largely unspoken. But those who worked with him began to notice the toll. Recording sessions became inconsistent. His once sharp focus blurred. His health began to decline subtly at first, then all at once. The problem wasn't just physical. It was spiritual and emotional. Johnson had grown up surrounded by faith gospel harmonies and discipline, but fame distanced him from his foundation. Alcohol, like with many others in high-pressure creative industries, served as an emotional cushion, a way to mute the anxiety, the expectations, the fatigue. In his later years, Louis faded from the public eye. Illness worsened, and so did isolation. On May 21, 2015, the world lost a giant. Official reports linked his death to liver failure, a complication often associated with long-term substance abuse. Though he's no longer here, Louis Johnson's legacy endures through every funky bass line and gospel backing he ever laid down. His story, like his playing, is layered, triumph and tragedy intertwined. And while the stage saw only the genius, his life reminds us that brilliance doesn't equal immunity from inner battles. Donnie McClurkin. Donnie McClurkin is a man of contradictions, anointed yet vulnerable, bold in the pulpit but bruised beneath the surface. His hit songs like Stand and We Fall Down are anthems of perseverance, testifying to the storms believers face. But what fans didn't know for years was that Donnie wasn't just singing about struggle, he was living it, often with a bottle nearby. Raised in a turbulent household in South Carolina, McClurkin endured unspeakable trauma as a child, including the early death of a sibling and experiences of abuse. The weight of those wounds followed him into adulthood. Music became his escape church, his refuge. But even the sanctuary couldn't shield him from the inner chaos. Behind closed doors, Donnie fought long and hard with depression. His emotional pain didn't come and go, it lingered often, showing up in the form of alcohol dependence that few in the church knew about. He never spiraled publicly. But those close to him witnessed a man in deep conflict trying to live holy while battling demons that wouldn't let him rest. What makes McClurkin's story unique is his willingness to talk about brokenness, even if it costs him. In interviews, he's been brutally honest about navigating his identity trauma and spiritual calling, all while maintaining a ministry that spans continents. He never claimed to be perfect. In fact, he openly admitted to years of internal confusion, emotional instability, and turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms to dull the pain. Donnie eventually found healing through counseling, faith, and the accountability of trusted friends. His message changed. It became deeper, not just about deliverance, but about the long road to it. He sang not from a place of victory, but from the battlefield itself. Today, as the founder of Perfecting Faith Church, McClurkin mentors others who feel unworthy to serve. He reminds them that God doesn't only use the spotless, He uses the scarred. His voice remains a balm for those too tired to keep pretending. Donnie McClurkin didn't fall from grace. He walked through it broken but still standing. Rance Allen. Rance Allen was a force of nature. With his wide vocal range, charismatic energy, and revolutionary fusion of gospel rock and soul, he shook the foundations of traditional gospel music. Alongside his brothers in the Rance Allen Group, he created a sound that inspired generations, earning respect from both pews and radio stations. Yet behind the soulful wails and foot-stomping performances was a man grappling with pressures that left him vulnerable to an invisible enemy: alcohol. Allen wasn't the type to boast about perfection, but even he struggled to reconcile his status as a bishop in the Church of God in Christ Kojic with the reality of personal battles few dared speak of. As his career flourished in the 70s and 80s, the growing demands of ministry music and expectation carved deep grooves of emotional exhaustion. And like many before him, he turned to the bottle not to celebrate, but to cope. Unlike others who spiraled publicly, Rance's drinking was quiet and carefully hidden. It never erased his faith, but it often complicated it. Friends close to the family recall moments when stress and sadness crept into his private life. The stage lights faded, the crowds went home, and the silence hit hard. But what made Rance Allen different was his relentless commitment to lifting others even when he struggled to lift himself. He kept creating, he kept preaching, and he kept evolving. Even through his silent battles, he produced timeless hits like Something About the Name, Jesus, a song that felt as much like a cry for comfort as it did a declaration of praise. Toward the end of his life, Allen's ministry focused more on mentorship and outreach. He reminded younger artists that gifts don't cancel out weakness and that true anointing comes with cost. When he passed away in 2020, the gospel world lost not just a vocalist, but a vessel of authenticity. Rance Allen's story shows us that even the strongest voices can carry secret burdens. And sometimes the sweetest songs are born from the deepest pain. John P. Key. John P. Key was a revolutionary force in gospel music, a choir leader with street smarts, urban flair, and a voice that could break chains. In the late 1980s and early 90s, his songs like Show Up, Jesus Is Real and Lily in the Valley became staples in black churches across America. But what many didn't know was that while Key was leading others into worship, he was also trying to escape his own addiction to alcohol and drugs. Born and raised in North Carolina, Key's journey into gospel music wasn't a straight path. Before becoming a minister, he lived a hard life, filled with violence, drugs, and crime. At one point, he was even involved in street gangs. Music was his gift, but pain was his companion. He tried to numb it the only way he knew, through substances that temporarily silenced the guilt. Key's addiction worsened just as his musical success began to soar. The irony was sharp. People praised him for leading praise, but he was losing his own battle backstage. He once shared in interviews that he would drink before rehearsals and recording sessions, believing that it gave him energy and boldness. But the high always crashed, and the shame always returned. Eventually, Key hit a wall, both spiritually and physically. One night, in what he described as a divine moment of confrontation, He realized that God wasn't going to keep blessing what he was faking. He entered recovery, removed himself from the toxic cycles, and began to build his life on solid ground. From that point forward, his ministry changed. It was no longer just about music. It was about truth. He founded the New Life Fellowship Center in Charlotte, where he began mentoring ex-offenders, addicts, and lost souls just like he once was. His songs became testimonies, not just melodies. Today, John P. Key stands as a redeemed leader, not because he hid his past, but because he overcame it. His story proves that even those chosen to lead the choir must first learn how to heal themselves. What does it really mean to fall from grace, and can you ever truly lose it? These gospel legends remind us that even the most anointed voices can stumble into darkness. But does their struggle with addiction tarnish their legacy, or does it make their testimonies even more powerful? At Legends of Black Excellence, we believe redemption doesn't erase the pain it gives, it purpose. So tell us, can brokenness and brilliance coexist in ministry? Drop your thoughts in the comments if this made you reflect, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold truths behind gospel's greatest voices.